Most people think water is the great equalizer. Think again. For most of recorded human history, water didn't clean you. It killed you. And the 1%, the emperors, the queens, the untouchable elite of the ancient world, knew it. So they replaced water entirely, with something far more expensive, far more revealing, and far more calculated than anyone tells you. They bathed in wine. Not wine-scented soap. Not a luxury gesture. Actual wine, barrels of it, poured over their bodies, soaked into their skin, and drained away like it meant nothing. And beneath that ritual lay something darker than decadence. Something that, once you see it, you can't unsee. To understand why the elite chose wine, you first need to understand what water meant to an ordinary person in the ancient world. It meant death. The river Tiber, running through the heart of Rome, a city of over 1 million people, was effectively an open sewer. Human waste, animal blood from the markets, the runoff of 1 million bodies in close proximity. All of it flowing into the same water people washed in and sometimes drank. Cholera, typhoid, dysentery. Not occasional outbreaks, permanent background noise. People died from contaminated water so routinely it barely warranted recording. And Rome was considered advanced. They had aqueducts, the most sophisticated water infrastructure the ancient world had produced. And still, the water was dangerous. The philosopher Marcus Aurelius, the emperor himself, described bathing in public as oil, sweat, filth, greasy water, everything loathsome. That is the ruler of the known world describing his own city's facilities. So imagine what everyone else was dealing with. It's worth pausing here, because most people assume clean water is ancient. But for the majority of human history, cleanliness was a privilege. That context matters for everything that follows. But the story doesn't start with water quality. It starts somewhere more interesting and considerably more grim. It starts with what the elite had already discovered about wine, long before any of this became fashionable. Roman legion surgeons used wine to clean battle wounds, not because they understood why — germ theory was nearly 2,000 years away — but because generations of observation had shown them something consistent. Wounds cleaned with wine became infected less often. What they had stumbled onto, without knowing it, was chemistry. Wine contains natural compounds, polyphenols, tannins, that have genuine antibacterial properties. Applied to skin, wine kills bacteria. It is a primitive antiseptic, used effectively long before the word existed. So when the elite bathed in wine and noticed better skin, fewer sores, fewer infections, they likely concluded it was the natural reward of their station. Divine favor. What it was accidental medicine. But here is where the story turns. Because the science was real, the motivation behind it was something else entirely. The finest Roman wines cost the equivalent of £80 a litre in today's money. Premium vintages were reserved for the emperor alone. To bathe in this, to pour it over your body and drain it away, was not a health choice. It was a statement. And nobody made that statement more extravagantly than the names history still remembers. Nero, Emperor of Rome. Historical accounts suggest he bathed in rose oil wine, a mixture of aged wine saturated with rose oil, and records indicate he once spent the equivalent of $200,000 in a single evening on rose oils, rose water, and petals for himself and his guests. One evening, his wife Poppaea Sabina appears to have considered wine insufficiently exclusive. Ancient sources, including Pliny the Elder, record that she bathed daily in donkey's milk, and that she traveled with a retinue of 500 donkeys to ensure a fresh supply wherever she went. Not for transport, not for food, for her morning bath. Whether every detail of these accounts is precise, historians broadly accept that this culture of extreme bathing excess among the Roman elite was real and widespread. What's striking isn't the eccentricity, it's the logic underneath it. Cleopatra, the last pharaoh of Egypt, is similarly associated with milk baths, the ritual thought to preserve her complexion. Whether the famous accounts are entirely factual or partly mythologized, the pattern is consistent across centuries and empires. The most powerful people in the ancient world had constructed a physical ritual around their bodies, one that said, clearly and expensively, "My skin does not touch what yours touches." What's interesting is that both Nero and Poppaea sound absurd to us now, but at the time, this signaled absolute power. Which version of excess feels more extreme to you, the wine or the 500 donkeys? But this is where the story stops being about ancient peculiarity and starts being about something that should make you genuinely uncomfortable. Because the darker part of the wine-bathing tradition isn't what the rich put in their baths, it's what ordinary people were going without so they could. In the ancient world, wine wasn't simply a drink. It was nutrition, it was calories, it was safety. For ordinary Romans, a diluted form of wine called posca, thin, sour, cheap, was often the safest liquid available. Not because they preferred it, because the small amount of alcohol made it less dangerous than river water. It was the everyday drink of soldiers, slaves, and laborers. When the elite poured barrels of undiluted premium wine over their bodies and drained it into the sewers, they were disposing of something that, to the person outside their walls, was a survival resource. Whether this was conscious cruelty or simple indifference is difficult to say with certainty. But the effect was the same. Seneca, the philosopher, deeply uncomfortable with the excess he witnessed, described wealthy Romans who took hot baths specifically to stimulate thirst for more wine afterward. Bath, drink, repeat. A private cycle of indulgence performed while outside, in 6-story wooden apartment blocks with no running water. Ordinary Romans either used the communal baths, shared by thousands, unchanged daily, or went unwashed. One 4th-century account describes aristocrats arriving at public bathhouses not to bathe, but to be seen. They came with 50 personal servants, reserved entire sections, displayed their finest jewelry, and left without touching the water. Because the performance was the point. The display of having resources you could afford to waste. That was what cleanliness meant to the powerful, not hygiene, and this is the part of the story that hasn't ended. Because the wine bath didn't die with Rome, it didn't disappear with the ancient world. It came back, repackaged, repriced, remarketed, and it is available right now. Walk into a high-end spa today, in Champagne, in Napa Valley, in certain hotels in London, and you will find wine baths on the menu. The treatment is called vinotherapy. It is real, documented, and expensive. Guests pay hundreds of pounds to soak in red wine, to have wine-based compounds massaged into their skin to emerge citing the antioxidant properties of grape polyphenols. The science, as it happens, is broadly legitimate. Those polyphenols are genuinely beneficial. The resveratrol in red wine does have antioxidant properties. Dermatologists acknowledge the chemistry, which means Nero was, accidentally, grotesquely, doing something medically defensible 2,000 years ago. But that's not what's interesting. What's interesting is that the ritual has survived intact. The same practice, the same logic, the same underlying message that certain people deserve access to something others cannot have, and that this access is itself the product. The label says wellness. The price tag says exclusivity. The history says something older and less flattering. It raises a question worth sitting with. What are the 1% doing right now, today, that people 500 years from now will look back on with the same mixture of fascination and disgust that we feel watching this? The most interesting answers I'll read out in next week's video. The wine bath is not a hygiene story. It is not a medical curiosity. It is a story about what power has always done, taking something ordinary, making it inaccessible, and using that inaccessibility to draw a line between bodies that matter and bodies that don't. That line has never really gone away. It just keeps changing costume. Next week, we look at something that happened inside the drawing rooms and nurseries of Victorian Britain. An object so commonplace, so deliberately ordinary in appearance, that the people manufacturing it understood exactly what it was doing. And kept selling it anyway. For over a century. Subscribe, because that one is considerably darker than this.